Hello, and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Every belief system comes from somewhere, and when you look closely at the origins of Christianity, you find that many of the ideas people now treat as absolute truth began as misunderstandings, political decisions, mistranslations, or even deliberate inventions. What billions see as solid ground often turns out to be sand when you trace each claim back to its roots. And the more you follow the trail, the more you realize that the version of Christianity most people know today is built on layers of things that were never originally part of the story at all. The first myth is the idea that early Christianity was unified. People imagine a single community with a shared message, but the historical reality shows dozens of competing groups who disagreed on almost everything. Some saw Jesus as fully human, others as entirely divine, others as a spirit-like figure who only appeared human, and some didn't include Jesus in their worldview at all. The movement was so fractured that early leaders spent more time fighting each other than converting outsiders. The narrative of a clear, consistent origin is something later writers polished to make the faith look more stable than it ever was. Another major distortion is the belief that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. These texts were written decades after the events they describe, in Greek, by authors who never met Jesus. They relied on oral stories passed from person to person, changing constantly as memories faded and communities tried to make the stories fit their needs. Details contradict each other in ways impossible to reconcile if the writers had all personally observed the same events. The traditional names attached to the Gospels came much later, added to give the books authority they never originally had. Then there's the false idea that the Bible was carefully preserved over time. Early manuscripts differ from one another in thousands of ways, including changes made intentionally by scribes who wanted the text to support specific beliefs. Some added lines to strengthen arguments about Jesus' divinity. Others softened language that sounded too human or too political. When people say the Bible is unchanged, they are referring to a version decided long after the earliest texts had already drifted apart. One of the biggest historical misconceptions is that Jesus claimed to be God in the way modern Christians understand it. Most of the statements used to support this idea come from the Gospel of John, the last gospel written, and the one most shaped by later theological development. The earlier accounts present a far more ambiguous figure, and the earliest Christian groups did not agree on his nature. The belief in Jesus as a literal divine being developed slowly, influenced by Greek philosophical ideas and competition with other religious movements that had divine human heroes. Another widely accepted myth is that the resurrection story was unique. In the ancient world, stories of dying and rising savior figures were extremely common. Cults across the region celebrated gods who died, returned, or transformed, symbolizing cycles of nature or human renewal. Early Christians lived among these traditions and borrowed language, imagery, and symbolism that felt familiar to people of the time. The Christian version wasn't born in isolation. It grew out of a cultural environment already filled with similar myths. There's also the idea that Christian morality came directly from Jesus and represented a radically new ethical system. But the teachings most Christians take pride in, love your neighbor, help the poor, treat others fairly, existed long before Jesus and appeared in Jewish traditions, Greek philosophy, and moral systems throughout the ancient world. The claim that Christianity invented compassion is historically inaccurate. What actually happened is that later writers presented these universal ethical ideas as unique proof of divine revelation. One of the most quietly influential myths is the belief that the Trinity was always central to Christianity. But the concept wasn't finalized until the 4th century, after heated debates, political power struggles, and church councils, where bishops voted on which beliefs to eliminate and which to promote. The Trinity wasn't discovered. It was negotiated. What many treat as sacred truth today was once a controversial idea that many early Christians rejected. A similar distortion surrounds the formation of the biblical canon. People assume the books were chosen because they were obviously inspired, but the selection was shaped by politics, popularity, and the desire for unity. Some books were included because they supported the theological positions of influential leaders. Others were left out because they didn't fit the emerging narrative or were too closely tied to groups deemed heretical. The final list was the result of debate, compromise, and pressure, not divine fingerprints. Another long-standing misconception is the belief that Christianity spread because it offered the most convincing truth. In reality, its growth depended heavily on the Roman Empire adopting it as a political tool. Once it became the state religion, alternatives were discouraged, suppressed, or outlawed. People didn't convert simply because of spiritual insight. Many converted because it became the safest, smartest, or only legal option. A belief system doesn't need truth to spread. It needs power and structure. There's also the assumption that early Christians were peaceful martyrs attacked for their beliefs. While persecution did occur at times, it was not constant or universal. In many cases, Christians exaggerated or embellished these stories to create a heroic identity. It helped the movement strengthen internal loyalty and portray itself as morally superior. The mythology of widespread martyrdom grew larger than the historical reality ever supported. Another deeply rooted myth is that biblical prophecy predicted Jesus with precision. Many of the so-called prophecies cited in Christian teachings were originally unrelated texts about historical events, political situations, or symbolic poetry. Early Christians reinterpreted these writings to make them fit Jesus' story, often taking lines out of context or applying meanings the original authors never intended. It wasn't that Jesus fulfilled prophecy. It was that later writers reshaped prophecy to match Jesus. One overlooked distortion is the belief that Christian rituals are purely Christian. Practices like baptism, communal meals, sacred wine, symbolic cleansing, and ceremonial readings existed in many religions long before Christianity came along. These rituals helped create familiar experiences that made conversion easier. The faith didn't invent these traditions. It adapted them from surrounding cultures. Another historically shaky claim is that Christianity provided the foundation for science, progress, or modern civilization. While some Christians contributed to these fields, the institution itself often resisted scientific discoveries, suppressed contradictory ideas, and punished those who challenged official doctrine. Progress usually came from people willing to question sacred assumptions, not from those defending them. Human advancement accelerates when people are free to think beyond the constraints of inherited beliefs. Perhaps one of the most underestimated myths is the idea that ancient religious authorities honestly preserved history. But many stories that shaped Christianity were crafted with intention: to inspire, to unify, to control, or to establish legitimacy. Leaders shaped narratives to suit their goals, and theological claims were elevated above factual accuracy. The line between history and storytelling blurred so frequently that separating the two today requires careful study and critical thinking. When you add these distortions together, the fractured origins, the anonymous authorship, the mistranslations, the political decisions, the borrowed myths, and the evolving doctrines, you start to see a bigger picture. Christianity wasn't built on a single moment of revelation. It was constructed gradually, shaped by cultures, empires, arguments, fears, hopes, and human imagination. And the stories people treat as sacred truth were often created, modified, or preserved because they served a purpose for someone along the way. This doesn't make the ideas meaningless, but it changes the weight we give them. It shows how easily beliefs can form around claims that were never meant to be taken literally, or that emerged from decisions rather than discoveries. And it reveals something many people sense, but rarely say out loud, that humans are capable of building entire worlds of meaning on foundations that shift the moment you look closely. In the end, the real question isn't whether these historical myths exist. The evidence for them is abundant. The question is what people do once they recognize them. Do they cling to the familiar stories out of comfort, or do they allow themselves to question the things they were always told not to question? All belief systems depend on the willingness of people to stop asking too many questions. But once you begin looking, really looking, you realize that the truth doesn't need protection, and stories only fall apart when they were fragile from the start. When you examine the origins honestly, Christianity's core narrative becomes something very different from what most people assume. Not a clear message passed down through the centuries, but a mosaic assembled by countless hands, each adding, removing, or reshaping pieces until the final picture looked convincing enough to endure. It's a human story, filled with human choices, human errors, human agendas, and human creativity. And there's something strangely freeing about that, because once you understand how these historical lies formed, how they shaped beliefs, identities, and cultures, you gain the ability to step outside the story and see it from the outside. You begin to understand how meaning is created, how traditions evolve, and how people can live their entire lives convinced of things that were never grounded in fact. And maybe that's the most important realization of all. The truth doesn't come from authority, or ancient books, or the stories repeated the longest. It comes from the willingness to think for yourself, even when the answers lead you away from what you were taught. And in that moment, you see clearly what was hidden in plain sight. That the stories used to build an entire religion were shaped by the same human forces that shape everything else. And once you know that, the myths lose their power, and the questions finally begin. When those questions begin, something shifts inside you. You start noticing how often people defend beliefs not because the ideas make sense, but because those beliefs hold their identity together. Questioning the story feels like questioning themselves, so they protect the story at any cost. It's a powerful reminder that people don't cling to religion because the evidence is strong. They cling to it because uncertainty feels dangerous. The irony is that uncertainty is where real understanding begins. When you let go of inherited explanations, you start seeing how the world works without needing supernatural shortcuts. You start noticing patterns, psychological patterns, cultural patterns, historical patterns. And those patterns explain far more than ancient stories ever could. Understanding replaces fear, curiosity replaces obedience, and the world becomes bigger instead of smaller. And the deeper you look at the origins of Christianity, the more the human fingerprints become impossible to ignore. The shifting stories, the political influence, the recycled myths, the evolving doctrines. These aren't signs of divine perfection. They're signs of human construction. They show a movement trying to survive, trying to unify, trying to stay relevant, trying to adapt to whatever challenges it faced at the time. The most striking part is how perfectly the religion mirrors the needs of the people who shaped it. When early communities needed hope, stories of miracles grew. When leaders needed control, rules and dogmas solidified. When empires needed unity, doctrine was standardized and alternatives were erased. You can trace the motivations behind each transformation, and they always lead back to human concerns, not divine revelation. Even today, the fragments of those old lies shape cultural norms, political decisions, and personal identities. People repeat claims that were invented centuries after the supposed events. They defend doctrines that were once debated intensely and rejected by entire branches of early Christians. They hold on to ideas that were influenced less by truth and more by power. And most of them never realize how many layers of myth they inherited without question. When people see these origins clearly, many feel a sense of betrayal, not because the world suddenly makes less sense, but because they were told all their lives that these stories were perfect, that the Bible was flawless, that the Church preserved truth faithfully, that doubt was dangerous. And then they discovered that the foundation was made of decisions, disagreements, and political strategies. But after the initial frustration fades, something more valuable takes its place. A sense of clarity, a sense of intellectual freedom, a sense of being able to trust your own mind instead of relying on explanations that fall apart under scrutiny. It's not about rejecting everything. It's about understanding where ideas come from and deciding which ones deserve a place in your life. There's also a strange comfort in realizing that humanity, not divine intervention, forged these stories. It means people are capable of building meaning, building community, building hope without needing supernatural authority to guide them. It means the human mind is powerful enough to create entire worlds of narrative, and also wise enough to step outside those narratives when they no longer serve us. And once you see the myths for what they are, you begin to see something else. That the most important truths aren't found in ancient texts, but in how people treat each other right now, in how they respond to new information, in how they handle uncertainty, in how willing they are to question ideas that were once considered untouchable. The irony is that many of the values people admire, compassion, honesty, curiosity, fairness, grow stronger when they're not tied to a belief system built on questionable origins. When morality comes from empathy instead of fear. When understanding comes from evidence instead of tradition. When meaning comes from the world itself instead of a story about the world. Looking at the 14 lies that helped build Christianity doesn't diminish human potential. It highlights it. It shows how capable people are of storytelling, organization, persuasion, creativity, and imagination. It shows how cultures evolve, how movements form, how ideas spread. And it shows how powerful the human desire for certainty can be, even at the expense of truth. But it also reveals something else, that the same human abilities used to build religions can be used to move beyond them, to build new ways of thinking based on evidence and understanding rather than inherited myths, to approach the world with curiosity instead of fear, to value questions as much as answers. Truth doesn't need stories to hide behind. It doesn't need authority to enforce it. It stands on its own, whether people believe it or not. And once you've seen how easily myths can shape entire civilizations, you become far more selective about which stories you let shape you. The past can't be changed, but the way we understand it can. And when you strip away the layers of invention, the political strategy, the borrowed mythology, and the mistranslations, you're left with something far more honest. A record of human beings doing what humans do, telling stories, seeking meaning, building identity, and trying to navigate a world that felt overwhelming. There's no shame in that, but there's power in seeing it clearly. And maybe that clarity is what people fear most. Because once you see how the stories were built, the walls surrounding them start to crumble, and what's left is not emptiness, but the possibility of building something grounded in reality instead of illusion. When you finally step outside the narrative and view it from the outside, you realize the truth was never hidden. It was just buried beneath centuries of interpretation and repetition. And once you brush away those layers, the picture that remains is far simpler, far more human, and far more honest. And honesty, in the end, is worth more than any myth. What honesty gives you is the ability to finally separate what's meaningful from what's merely inherited. It lets you look at the ideas you grew up with and ask a simple question. Do they hold up on their own, or do they only survive because people agreed not to question them? Once that question enters your mind, the old structure of belief starts to loosen, not out of rebellion, but out of a desire for clarity. And clarity reveals something most people never consider, that letting go of these ancient distortions doesn't take anything valuable away. It doesn't erase compassion or purpose or the need for connection. What it removes is the pressure to force your worldview into the shape of stories that never fit the real world in the first place. Without that pressure, your perspective becomes lighter, more flexible, and more honest. There's a strange kind of peace that comes from no longer having to defend things that don't make sense. From being able to say, "I don't know," without fear. From recognizing that understanding the universe doesn't require ancient authority, it requires curiosity and evidence. And the more you lean into that mindset, the less appealing blind certainty becomes. Because certainty based on shaky foundations doesn't make you stronger. It makes you fragile. It forces you to defend ideas you're not allowed to examine, and anything that can't be questioned becomes a source of anxiety rather than confidence. When people feel threatened by new information, it's usually because their beliefs were built on illusions they weren't supposed to notice. But when your worldview is built on evidence instead of myth, new information isn't a threat. It's an opportunity. You're free to grow, free to change, free to refine your understanding without feeling like you're betraying anything. That's the difference between beliefs protected by fear and ideas supported by reason. And the deeper you dive into the origins of Christianity, the more you see how fear played such a central role in maintaining the narrative. Fear of questioning, fear of doubt, fear of punishment, fear that without the story, life would lose meaning. These emotions were powerful tools for keeping the structure intact, century after century. The truth is that meaning doesn't disappear when the myths fall away. It comes into focus. It becomes something you build deliberately instead of something handed to you with rules attached. You're no longer confined to a single lens for understanding human life. You can explore philosophy, psychology, science, history, art, all the ways humans have tried to understand themselves and their world. And the more perspectives you encounter, the more obvious it becomes that no single ancient narrative can capture the complexity of human existence, especially one formed through mistranslation, political ambition, cultural borrowing, and centuries of editing. What's remarkable is that once people step back from the story, even slightly, they begin to notice how often the so-called truths of Christianity contradict the reality we see every day. How often doctrines oppose basic common sense. How often stories break down under scrutiny. How many claims rely on faith precisely because evidence is missing. You start to see that the strength of the religion has never been in its accuracy. It's been in its ability to demand loyalty to ideas that can't be verified. And once you recognize that, you begin to understand why questioning these stories feels so unsettling for many. It's not the loss of truth they fear, it's the loss of certainty. But certainty built on illusions collapses the moment you stop repeating the script. And once it collapses, it becomes clear that understanding the world doesn't require ancient answers. It requires the courage to accept reality as it is, even when the truth is more complicated than the myth. And maybe that's the real turning point, not rejecting religion out of anger, but out of understanding, out of recognizing that a story constructed over centuries, shaped by countless human hands, can no longer hold the weight people try to place on it. That it wasn't designed to answer the questions we now have, and it never had the tools to explain the world we now understand. But recognizing that doesn't create a void, it creates space. Space for curiosity, space for discovery, space for ideas grounded in evidence rather than authority. Space for meaning that grows instead of meaning that must be protected at all costs. And once you experience that kind of freedom, the old lies lose their power. They become artifacts of history, interesting, influential, but no longer controlling your view of reality. They become something you study, not something you live under. That shift, from inherited belief to deliberate understanding, is one of the most significant changes a person can experience. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't require dramatic declarations. It just requires honesty. The same honesty that reveals how the earliest Christian stories were shaped, reshaped, and reinforced through centuries of repetition. Honesty that acknowledges how human these stories truly are, how deeply they reflect the fears, hopes, and political needs of the societies that created them, and how little remains when you strip away the layers and look for something objective underneath. But what remains, the human experience, the search for meaning, the desire to understand, is far more authentic than any doctrine. It's something shared across cultures, across time, across belief systems, and it doesn't require myth to survive. In the end, the story of Christianity's origins isn't a story about divine truth. It's a story about human storytelling, about how narratives grow, how institutions form, how ideas gain power, and how easily people accept claims that feel comforting, even when the facts tell a different story. And knowing that doesn't diminish humanity. It elevates it. It shows how capable people are of questioning the very stories that once shaped their world. It shows how far we've come in our ability to understand ourselves and the universe around us. It shows that truth doesn't hide. It waits for us to look closely enough. And once you do, you can never unsee it. You can only move forward with a clearer mind, a deeper understanding, and a perspective no longer shaped by the historical lies that built an entire religion.